engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to The Naked Scientists podcast, the show that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith, and today, how our ancient ancestors, going back up to hundreds of thousands of years, made the leaps that they did from ritualistically burying their dead to art, avoiding disease and even discovering drugs and medicines. Anatomically modern humans, like us, have been around for about 300,000 years. That's roughly when we split from an ancestor we shared with Neanderthals. In the time since, we've mastered materials, medicine, machinery, and even moon travel. But one thing really stands out about our species. We revere our dead. And we have evidence going back at least 100,000 years that we afford the departed special treatment. Historically, people argued that our big brains and social instincts, factors that make us so successful as a species, are behind this inclination. But then, along came a remarkable discovery from South Africa a decade ago. A deep cave system crammed with the 250,000-year-old remains of a new and completely different species of human ancestor, Homo naledi. These creatures were not like us. They were from a different evolutionary path and only distantly related to us. They also had much smaller brains than we do, but a cave full exclusively of their bones suggested they were burying their dead. Initially, other paleoanthropologists were very sceptical, but now new research has added a significant and even more compelling twist to the story. By analysing a gene product called amylogenin, which is found in different forms on the X and Y chromosomes, Lee Berger and his colleagues have found that the remains in the cave are all female.
It's all about Homo naledi and questions that have been building around this fascinating species. Homo naledi is a kind of quick backstory we discovered in 2013. We announced in 2015 as a new species in the genus Homo, a very primitive species in look with a very small brain. About the size of a chimpanzee, but on a very tall, slender bipedal body that looked like it should have been 2 million years old, but existed in southern Africa at 250,000 years old. Perhaps even more remarkable was the situation we found it in. Chambers deep inside the Rising Star cave system just outside of Johannesburg, hundreds of meters back, dozens of meters below the surface, in a situation where initially they were alone. There was nothing there but them.
Just to explain the significance of that.
Every other ancient human, ancient hominin, ancient human relatives, and even Neanderthals are almost always found with lots of other dead things. And the reason they're found with lots of other dead things is either the places they die or are found to die are accessible by other things, whether they be carnivores, scavengers, things that get lost in caves. Homo naledi was alone in this situation. There were almost no animal remains with him. And when I say almost no, there were a couple of baboon teeth eventually, some microfauna, mice, rodents, that kind of thing, some rabbits, small animals, and no other animals their same size.
And how many naledi specimens were there?
In the first instance, 15. That has grown to almost 36 right now. But I'll give you a little secret. There are dozens and dozens more bodies in there. We know they're there. We can see parts of them. We know where they are.
So you have a huge assemblage of exclusively one species in a hard-to-access cave system deep underground near Johannesburg. How do you explain, or how do people explain that?
Well, when we first announced them, we didn't have an explanation other than what we would apply to humans. Humans are the only other animal that you would find that situation in. And the reason you would find humans in that actually fairly commonly is we separate ourselves at death. So we hypothesized at the time that they were deliberately disposing of their dead. Now, that went over like the proverbial lead balloon. The idea that a small-brained hominid would be practicing some sort of ritual or repeated behavior to separate its dead is very complex.
And just to be clear, if we look at not just the remains, which you can date, but the context they're in, you can date that, and it isn't that someone put the remains there later.
No, that's right. They appear to be the only thing interacting with the system. There's no evidence that carnivores took them there. There's no evidence of catastrophe. They came in slowly over time. And even more remarkably at the time, we did note a very interesting thing about them. They all looked alike. They didn't vary. Now, we had infants, we had neonates, we have young children, we have young adults, and then we have adults, and we have elderly. They look like a symmetry population. There were some that were a little larger than each other, and we did what I guess any biologist naively would do. We said the larger ones are males, and the smaller ones are females. And if you go back and read those original papers in eLife, and you should, you'll see we were right on something then. We knew there was a problem. We said they were the least sexually dimorphic species ever discovered. The only comparables would be some human populations of closely related individuals. And that was our explanation. Right in front of us was the answer to one of the most extraordinary discoveries I will ever be involved in my entire career.
Are you saying then that you were wrong, that they're not males and females?
I'm saying that we were absolutely wrong because a few years ago, I took samples to Copenhagen, a lab there, where they had advanced a technique looking at ancient proteins. Part of the output of those ancient proteins was looking at the amylogenin or gene in Y, the absence or presence of a Y chromosome within that. We could tell that from these ancient proteins. And almost immediately, we began getting very odd results. They had no Y chromosome. So we took some more. They also showed no marker for a Y chromosome. That would run up to 23 samples being done.
And let's be clear, the absence of a Y chromosome, if that were, say, you and me, it wouldn't be you and me because men have Y chromosomes. Women have exclusively X chromosomes. So you're kind of speculating that the absence of Y says, well, these are all one sex and they're all not male.
I think it's a little more than speculation in the sense that, yes, there are individual situations where a male may not show these markers for a Y chromosome, but they are literally fractionally small. These are females.
So if they were ritualistically interring their dead, they were doing it with a bias towards females. They were only interring in that cave females.
That is what they say. You may remember that a few years ago when we talked about this on your show that we argued that they were burying their dead. We said we moved beyond ritual body disposal to burial. We also argued there were engravings on the walls. Now we have evidence that there is sex selection in the dead. Only little girls went there. And I want to say something here that 50% are subadults. Many of those are infants and babies. There are no baby boys. If this were some matriarchal society or some collection of women and children, there'd be baby boys. They, Homo naledi, a non-human species with a brain slightly larger than a chimpanzee, was selecting its women and girls for this space in death.
Tell me more about the other elements in the context that you're referring to, engravings on the wall and so on.
There are these geometric engravings on the wall. They've been carved there into the wall. They look like they've been done repeatedly over time. Some of them have been covered up with earth from the floor of the cave and maybe some other substances. There are triangles, there are hashtags, there are pounding marks, there are sort of chevron kind of markers on the wall, there are squares, ladder-like structures. They're all right above these graves. We have no evidence that humans were ever in there.
It's also damn nigh impossible to get in there. I mean, I remember when you published the advert for staff, and it was the most politically incorrect advert you probably ever see. And I only want female, very skinny archaeologists to come and excavate something was, I think it was worded slightly more diplomatically, but it's hard to get there. It's dark. How on earth would they have seen what they were doing?
Because they had fire.
Do you know that? How do you know that?
We've got evidence of fire all through there. I announced that a few years ago. You're going to see some work on the dates of those and that, but there's evidence of fire throughout the system. Now, what's interesting is that we have now found burnt bone remains of animals and stuff, but not in those chambers. They took fire into those chambers where they buried their dead.
And what sort of time spans the earliest to the most recent specimen? It wasn't just, say, one particular individual with a penchant for caching things like a squirrel, and it just happened to cache dead bodies of females. Was there evidence of a culture here? It's going on over a period of time that would have outlived one individual.
Oh, absolutely. And we have strong evidence of them digging through dead bodies, upturn the bones, and then put them back. But if you go back and read some of the papers we published last year in 2025 on the burials, you can see that they also did some interesting things, like they put the heads back very carefully in the same direction. We can see this is kind of gross, but the rotting tidal lines on the skulls of where the bodies next to them would rot, send their fluids out and leave a tidal line. The head would be disrupted by a later digging event, and then the tidal line would appear. So this is a generational thing. We are looking at a complex, non-human culture.
Sends a shiver down your spine, doesn't it? So it looks like the instincts towards rituals in death might date back far farther than we believed, and wasn't just the sole preserve of us anatomically modern humans either. Lee Berger there. He's just published that work in the journal Cell this week. Now, from rituals in death to another form of ancient culture, and that's art. At the Gower near Swansea, just over a century ago, 10 horizontal red stripes were discerned on the wall of Bacon Hole Cave. Archaeologists didn't initially know what they were, but they've now been identified as Britain's oldest prehistoric art, dating back more than 17,000 years. It's thought that these paintings may have been created by early ancestors as they surveyed the changing seasons and dinner over what is now the Bristol Channel between Wales and southwest England. This was just as the Ice Age was ending, so the land that these people, who were some of our direct ancestors, were exploring was very different to the estuarine environment that it is today. George Nash at the University of Coimbra in Portugal has the story.
It's quite some way into a site called Bacon Hall. It's in a side chamber, which you'd expect. And on the wall are a series of 10 bars painted in red hematite. And they are covered by a calcite flow or a speleotherm, which covers over the art. It's very, very difficult to see. And this is probably one of the reasons why it was dismissed way back in 1928.
So this is not a new discovery. This was discovered and then lost, effectively.
Oh, goodness me, yes. Yeah. This was discovered in 1912 by a geologist called Professor William Solis from Oxford, and what we call the father of prehistory, the Abbé Broyel, who was a French monk who became interested in archaeology, prehistory. And they met up in 1912 and decided to walk around the caves of the Gower. At the time, William Solis was actually excavating Paviland Cave. And so they went into Bacon Hole and found this remarkable discovery. The news was sent to the Manchester Guardian and the New York Times. It went round the world. And then luckily, it was picked up by a guy called William Morgan in 1913, who did a really very, very good detailed scientific report on this, published in an obscure journal, unfortunately. But he took the first photograph. And the first photograph is obviously black and white. Unfortunately, it was published sideways on. So it looks like the lines, which are actually horizontal, it's portrayed as being vertical. So that needed to be rectified for a start when we were doing our research.
But how did it get overlooked, forgotten about, and then it's back in the frame again with you looking at it?
Inspectors of ancient monuments were going down there and obviously from time to time verifying it, see if they could see it or not, and they couldn't. And I think what it basically is, without being too arrogant, is that they didn't know what they were looking for. If you're looking for an Iron Age hill fort, you'll find it because it's pretty obvious that it's a hill fort. But if you're looking for painted rock art, which is hidden behind a white calcite flow, it's very, very difficult to see. And you do need a good pair of eyes and experience working in caves and working with rock art to actually identify it.
And how did you get involved?
Right. Well, I was teaching at Bristol University for about 19 years, and one of my jobs was to take students on an annual visit to Paleolithic sites to give them some idea about what it felt like to be in the Paleolithic. So I wasn't particularly looking at rock art. And we tried Paviland Cave, but it was too dangerous to get to. We tried other caves, and then Bacon Hole came up for about 2 or 3 years. So for 2 or 3 years, I was taking him down here, telling him the same stories I'm telling you now about its history of archaeology. And I never found it. So in 2022, I was doing a filming project with the Discovery Channel, and I was with a colleague, Barbara, and she said, "Hey, what's this then, George?" And then pointed to these horizontal lines, or some of the horizontal lines behind this calcite flow. We were actually talking about it as she discovered it. So it was a remarkable sort of coincidence and a complete elation about how we just discovered or rediscovered the rock art. And if you go down there now, you will see just about the faint red bars, 10 of them in a row, horizontally laid, painted out, and that's how we discovered it. But there's still work to be done there, because it's not just the bars we found other things as well. But because I was specifically interested in focusing on the bars, I didn't really have much chance to sort of expand the research or survey of that particular side chamber.
So who painted it and when?
We actually got to 3 layers, 3 stratigraphic layers. One was 17,100. The other was around about 4,000 before present. And the other one was 2,000 before present. So we've got really a prehistoric development of a calcite flow forming over the painted imagery.
You've looked at one line. There are 10. So is it possible that someone was coming back every 100 years, every 1,000 years? And in fact, if you looked at other lines, you get different dates.
I think it was all done as one event, because we did analysis on the hematite, which is the red ochre, the color, the pigment that constructs the 10 bars on the panel. And that came locally, probably inside the side chamber itself. And we know that it was put on with finger dots. So they were mixing the pigment with water, and then they were applying a wet gloopy paint onto the panel using their fingers. How they did it, I do not know, but very, very straight line. It could be, as you say, as a series of 10 events, maybe done annually. But because of the fragile nature of the paint, we didn't allow ourselves to do 10 lots of samples from the 10 different bars, only because when you start to scrape away the calcite, you can potentially damage the actual paint itself. So we restricted ourselves to 10 samples from different parts of the panel, not just the bars itself, but there are other things there which we had to sample. And then we had one date, which gave us 17,100. Now, what we've got to do, I'm now in negotiations with the landowners, the National Trust, to do more sampling there at some point in the near future.
Now, 17,000 odd years puts us at the tail end of the ice age that had gripped the planet. Most of the UK was under still quite considerable amounts of ice. It was very cold at that time. Sea levels would have been a lot lower. So presumably there wouldn't have been a Bristol Channel like we have now, separating Wales from the north of the southwest, as it were. So who were these people who were doing this, and what were they doing there?
They were all early modern humans. They're people like you and I in a very, very cold climate. So average summer temperatures would be around about -10. If you were to walk out of the cave and then look northwards, you would probably see a line of ice, maybe a kilometre high. The Bristol Channel would have been a large fertile plateau, but permafrost. And what you would have is mosses, sedges, lichens, and grasses, which would be growing there in the spring and summer months. And that would be an ideal environment for megafauna, large animals such as mammoth, bison, elk, reindeer, and horse. So those migratory herds would be coming from the south to take advantage of the rich feeding grounds of what is now the Bristol Channel. And you would have had hunter, fisher, gatherer communities, small communities, watching out in the spring, or maybe even following the herds and staying in those caves during those warmish months of the hunting year. So that's the reason why we have a large amounts of bone coming from different caves along the coast. And so quite clearly they were killing those animals, dragging them up into the caves, and then procuring their meat and also the carcasses for things like skin, clothing, and also for bone tools, etc., etc.
But why they made those lines on the cave wall and what they were depicting is still a mystery. A fascinating story. George Nash there.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith, and today we are delving into the past antics of our ancient ancestors. In a minute, what did cavemen know about medicine? But first, let's look at how disease risk has shaped early human activity. The parasitic infection malaria is one of the biggest health threats we encounter today. 90% of cases are in Africa, and spread by mosquitoes, the disease is concentrated around the equatorial regions of the continent. Now, if we look at the archaeology, that suggests that many of these regions were no-go areas for humans until about 15,000 years ago, when something suddenly changes and people begin to make incursions into those regions. So what could have driven this? Well, an analysis by Cambridge University's Andrea Manica suggests that we evolved the gene change for sickle cell anemia. Yes, this can be harmful if you get a double dose of the gene, but if you're a carrier, it's powerfully protective against malaria. And that change, he thinks, unlocked fresh ground and could ultimately have helped to push people towards a more urban existence in the longer term.
We've known for a long time diseases have been really important for our species. During medieval time, plague wiped out almost 2/3 of Europe. We know that malaria is still a major killer in Africa. We've seen the pandemic recently with COVID and how much that can suddenly change our society. What we've never really been sure about, though, is how important were diseases before people invented food production and therefore stopped in a place in large numbers. So most of our sort of ancient history is actually one of hunter-gatherers, small bands moving around the environment in rather small numbers. And so it's unclear at that point whether diseases can really impose a big pressure on such small groups or whether other problems like starvation would have been really the drivers of selection.
How can you get at that then, given it was so long ago? We're talking, 60, 70 plus thousand years ago?
It is indeed a long time ago, and so the problem is that we don't have direct evidence for it. So what we did was actually to take a slightly roundabout route. So we looked at where the vectors of malaria, the mosquitoes that carry malaria in Africa, are at the moment. And there are about a dozen species which are really important. And what we did was to basically look at each of these species, determine what kind of environmental conditions, what kind of temperatures, how much precipitation you need, what kind of vegetation you need, and effectively define what ecologists call the niche where these particular species live right now. And then we use paleoclimate models to actually reconstruct where each of them would have been back in the past. And once we had a map of each of these species and how they moved around the continent, we could actually combine them together using some models that epidemiologists have built to actually predict how important is malaria now and how important might be malaria in the future. But in this case, we use those models to actually go back in the past to be able to say where malaria might have been.
So you end up with a historical map of malaria, effectively. You would have been able to point to a map of Africa and say this bit, this bit, this bit, these were malaria hotspots back in the past.
So what we could say was if malaria was there, would have been a really big problem. So in a way, we could actually say the areas where malaria could have been really prevalent. And that actually was the key finding of our studies when we actually then worked together with some archaeologists and put together all the archaeological information we have about our persistence in Africa back for the last 70,000 years. What we found was that all those hotspots were places where people were not. What we don't know is whether people were avoiding those places or whether they were just going there and dying very quickly.
Yeah, indeed, because it could be that's a swamp that mosquitoes love, and hence it would be a potential site for malaria to thrive, but people are not going to go there. Or were the people eschewing the area because there was the pressure of disease? Malaria was driving them away or killing them off.
Yeah, we do have some interesting hints from the archaeological record. There was this practice of using ochre as potentially an insect repellent. So probably people were bothered by insects and they were definitely aware. But what we don't know is in those areas which were particularly difficult because of malaria, whether people were really avoiding them actively or whether they were kind of going to their death on a regular basis. What we know, though, is that about 15,000 years ago, all of a sudden in West Africa, we start seeing people pushing into those areas that before were really, really not used. And what we also know from other studies is that about the same time in the area, we have the emergence of sickle cell anemia. Now, this is a mutation in our genome which can actually give us protection against malaria. Having said that, the problem of that mutation is if we have two copies, so if we receive one copy from mom and one copy from dad, we're dead. So in a way, to have such a problematic, in a way, solution to the problem being selected for, it means that malaria must have been a really important major driver. And indeed, we know now that the selection coefficient, so the strength of selection for this particular gene, is one of the highest in humans.
This argues then that a fairly dramatic change happens. We evolve the sickle cell trait about 15,000 years ago, and this unlocks access to these areas that previously were off limits for whatever reason. People are driven away by malaria. What effect does your data suggest that would have had on our early ancestors?
What we see at that particular point is definitely that there is this increase in connectivity throughout Africa. And there are arguments that potentially that is the precursors of eventually building up enough innovation that would have allowed you to have food production and would have actually allowed you to get some of the big changes that we see demographically in Africa that lead to these eventually sedentary groups that stick to one place and actually change the environment as much as we're changing it now. And indeed, in these periods is when we start seeing the start of more fires, more changes of forests being transformed into something. Is not the full production, the agriculture that we kind of think about normally, but is the very first steps of people changing their relationship with the environment, in a way shaping it more and more.
There are other diseases that people have pointed a finger at and said, we can find evidence that there are genetic changes in humans that seem to protect against those and may come at a cost to the humans. Cystic fibrosis, the gene, is incredibly common in the human population, and some argue it gives us defense against certain bacterial infections like typhoid. So do you think that your analysis, you've found this really interesting relationship between sickle cell trait and protection against malaria? Could we see a similar effect with these other genetic changes?
It's quite possible. Some of them obviously will be more recent events like the plague, and we know that there are, for example, a couple of mutations in a couple of current diseases, autoimmune diseases that might have well been favored during the plague, giving a bit better response to that disease. What we're starting now, in a way, is a bit of a bigger project to try and think about how many diseases can we track back in the past, like we have done for malaria, and see, in a way, how many of the stories that we have, though quite often very quickly attributed to more historical times, might actually have some deeper roots. Some will just be historical, but my bet would definitely be that some of them have an older story to be told.
And we look forward to hearing what Andrea Manica can turn up next. Now, these days, we're extremely used to popping down to the chemist shop for a prescription to treat various diseases. But thousands of years ago, nature was that medicine chest. Indeed, it still is, because a significant proportion of the top 10 drugs we use every day have their direct origins in nature. But how cognizant were our ancestors of the various plant-based remedies available to them? And where did they even learn this? Emeritus Professor of Pharmacology at Queen Mary University of London, Rod Flower, has just written a book all about the use of medicine throughout history. It's called Drugs, the Story of Pharmacology. So what's the evidence that our forebears made medicine and even mind-altering drugs?
A lot of this, of course, comes from the examination of burial sites, particularly those from the sort of late Stone Age, about 12 to 50,000 years ago. This was the time, when man was making art, making stone tools. There's evidence in some communities of organized burials, evidence of ritual behavior. And from these burial sites, scientists have found the remains of plants which contain pharmacologically active substances. Now, you may ask, how do we know that they weren't simply there for foodstuffs or decoration? And I think one answer is that all these plants are incredibly bitter and they have no nutritional value and they're almost unpalatable. So I think it's very unlikely that they'd be there because they were foodstuffs being buried alongside. It's more likely they had another purpose.
Isn't there sort of ancient law that said that if you want something to be a good, powerful agent, it's got to taste bitter?
That's absolutely right. And there are, in some cultures, the ability to taste bitter tastes, or at least to display a preference for bitter tastes, is used as a sort of marker of well-being and recovery from illness. So, it sort of fits together in a way. And we know that the gene for tasting bitter substances was present in Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
What sorts of substances have been found then that would be both bitter and tick that box, but also would tick the pharmacological box? This is likely to have some kind of medicinal or mood-altering effect.
In Menorca, at a burial site called El Carix, which is a Bronze Age site actually, which dates back to about 3000 BC, I suppose, there was ephedrine, which is a drug now used for the treatment of asthma, atropine, which again used in medicine today, but in high doses can produce a disorientation and trance-like effects, and also scopolamine, which again is used in contemporary medicine, but would have an effect on the brain which caused a sort of delirium and a type of trance. Other sites have uncovered traces of artemisinin, which is an anti-malarial discovered by the Chinese, and also some sites contain hallucinogens derived from mushrooms such as psilocybin and substances like that. And there's one particular case where hair samples were recovered from an ancient grave, and these hair samples, as you know, can be analysed, and the drug consumption can be calculated by the amount of drug in each centimetre of hair. And so we know that these weren't simply one-off burial goods, but they were actually regularly ingested over a period of weeks, if not months. So that means that they were, more of a medicine than anything else.
Where do you think that people, our ancient ancestors, would have got the know-how for this, though? Was this trial and error? They just ate stuff and occasionally got some sometimes good, sometimes bad effects and learned from their mistakes?
That's certainly one route. You can imagine it, can't you? Somebody plucks a berry off a bush, they take it, they develop, for example, chronic sickness and diarrhea or something like that. They would note that effect, and then next time that they want to induce that for some ritual or other purpose, then they would know to use those berries. If they found, on the other hand, the berries were very, very toxic to themselves or to their animals or whatever, then they might use them as arrow poisons or something like that. But there's also another very interesting possibility, and that is that we learnt a lot from the behaviour of animals. And there's quite a lot of interest in this field now. It's called zoopharmacology. It's a bit of a mouthful. But it turns out that many animals do use medicines instinctively. Animals line their nests with plants that are known to have pesticide properties. They ingest thistles to remove parasites from their gut. Chimpanzees and orangutans have been observed to put poultices on wounds. So I think it's possible that we learnt some of these uses from animals, and it may even be that somewhere in our genomes there's a sort of a set of genes which codes for the behaviour involved in seeking out medicinal substances when you're ill. Maybe that's just been suppressed by years of of regular mainstream medicine. When we're ill, there are things that we crave that may be a sort of a relic of that behaviour.
And the fact that we do actually like bitter things, for instance, coffee has a lot of caffeine. That's a plant alkaloid. It's incredibly bitter. We like it. So have we therefore evolved to like bitter things because it helped us to seek out, and then it entrenched using these agents in this way that we were looking at animals using?
We also have to remember gin and tonic. This was used as a prophylactic for malaria, really, because it contained quinine. Of course, people didn't understand how it worked in those days, but nonetheless, it was a quite useful way of taking quinine. Together with
the gin and tonic, or the or both?
I've never seen animals making gin and tonic, but
But what about mood altering? Because obviously the one thing that gin and tonic will do is it will alter your mood, and there's a different sort of realm there, because we've talked so far about medicinal use and reactive use of agents when you're ill or to prevent yourself becoming ill. What about intentional use of things that will change the way your brain works, albeit temporarily? When did people, do we think, start to delve into recreational drugs?
There's one particular example I can think of, and that was the Koryak people. That's the Russian Far East, really. They used to use a mushroom-infused liquor in their feasts to alter the mood of the revellers, as it were. And the mushrooms that they used were extremely expensive and rare. And so the custom was, once one person had consumed the mushroom, a lot of it was excreted in the urine, so the urine would be given to somebody else, and they'd drink it, and they would become similarly intoxicated, and then they'd pass it on, and so on. And this could go on for several repetitions before the effect wore off.
Well, I'm glad I've never been to one of those parties. Rod Flower there, author of Drugs, The Story of Pharmacology. It's a really good read if you want to pick up a copy. Well, that's where we're going to leave it for this week, but we will have the latest science news stories from the week for you on Friday, including the former Astronomer Royal, Lord Martin Rees, who will be on the programme to explain why he's certain that aliens exist. We'll also have our usual updates on LinkedIn, on X and on Instagram. And if you'd like to support our work, we would really appreciate that. You can head over to nakedscientist.com/donate. I'm Chris Smith. Thank you for listening. And until next time, from all of us here at the team, goodbye.